I'm Scott Rose, and I've joined Vector about a year and a half or so ago after close to 30 years in the financial services industry. My role here, as we all have very distinct roles, is I work with onboarding new prospects to their client status. But today, most importantly, is sharing a life event, divorce. And I went through that about 9 years ago. I am remarried, but it was pretty interesting because I never saw myself as ever getting divorced. We were married for 26 years. She was a stay-at-home mom for the vast majority of that time. My ex-wife, I guess I should say. So it was a pretty interesting event for us both. We did go through a collaborative process instead of litigation, so a little bit different. I'm sure you'll address kind of the ins and outs of all those, but so to introduce you, Sharon Calhoun, you're our managing director, the head of the firm in essence. And you have a tendency, I believe, to have, just by nature of perhaps you being a female, working with females that have gone through divorce or are going through divorce or kind of are widowed, right? So kind of like that life transition. You've got alphabet soup after your last name. A lot of different designations, but I think one of the most important ones there is the CDFA. Obviously, during this podcast, we're not giving legal advice because we don't practice law, but maybe you can articulate a little bit more on CDFA, what that is.
Sure.
What that means.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to thank you, Scott, for being here.
Of course.
And also thank you for sharing your personal journey kind of going through divorce. Like you said, you were married for many years and suddenly you found yourself now going through a divorce. And like for many people, right, when they kind of map out their life's journey, divorce certainly usually isn't on that list.
Right.
And so again, I appreciate you sharing that. Maybe through our discussion today, we can talk to you a little bit more about things that went well and maybe things that didn't go quite so well. But to your point, a CDFA is a Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. And what's unique about that particular designation is it's usually an individual who has a financial planning background, which is what I have. But it could also be an accounting background. It could be a legal background. But it's someone that has the ability to do the analysis and deliver that expertise as it pertains to financial issues around divorce.
Okay.
Right? So let's talk about, what is divorce, right? High level, step number one, it's emotional.
Right.
And not only is it emotional, but it's a major life event. And, I'm sure you can speak to that, kind of going through that later in life.
Sure.
Any comments from you in regards to that?
Yeah. And, before we get too far ahead, I think it's important to note that we're really going to look at this in three major steps, right? Before divorce, during divorce, and after divorce. And so, that content, I think, is set up like that because there are real breakpoints during that process and different ways to assess the situation and make recommendations for the folks that you're working with. It was weird. Our situation, not to get too personal about it, but again, married for 26 years. I grew up in the Chicago area. She was from St. Paul, and we ended up living in Arizona. So she felt very separated from her family. I loved living in Arizona. And so at one point in time, she started to get uncomfortable with being there. And we kind of grew apart in that way. Our kids were all older. Our youngest of four was 18 at that time. He was a senior in high school. So, the thought process around, we don't have similar interests. We don't have similar needs from a perspective of she wanted to be close to her parents. My parents were in Colorado and in Florida. So it was a very different, she has a very big family in St. Paul. So very different situation. But yeah, we started just simply growing apart and just realized at one point, after I took a job and a transfer back to Minneapolis from Arizona, that this, that separation period where I was living in an apartment in downtown Minneapolis and she was still in Phoenix and I was kind of commuting, or Scottsdale, we were still commuting, is like, this is better for us both, like this separation, right? It's kind of like when we got together, we started getting a little bit, there's some friction there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's kind of how we landed in, and again, we went through a collaborative process, not litigation. So it was a little bit easier. There were some bumps along the road, though. It's not all, if you hear the word collaborative, you tend to think that everybody's in agreement on all of these waypoints, and that just wasn't the case, but you try to be as civil as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, wow. So you bring up some good points. And like you said, having that separation for that period of time sounds like kind of brought you to, probably both of you, to realize, hey, we're probably better apart than we are together.
Right.
And so, in my mind, when you think about divorce, the first thing you think about is that emotional piece.
Yep. 100%.
Right.
Yep.
So for some people, there's sadness, there's anger, there is regret. For some people, there's relief.
Right.
So, I think step number one, as we think about going through a divorce, I think we have to give ourselves permission to say, you know what, it's okay to have all of these feelings, and you're going to, at different points, experience a lot of these feelings.
Yep.
But the other thing too that we need to be mindful of is taking care of yourself first.
Right.
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 I always use the analogy when you're about to, leave for a trip. You're going through the plane instructions when they say secure your own mask first before assisting others. And I feel like that's true in so many aspects of our life. If we are not healthy, mind, body, and soul, it's hard for us to help others, whether it's our family, our children. And so giving ourselves permission to feel these feelings and to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. You can't really think rationally unless you do that. And you're entering into this critical thought process, right? Of, when we're going to get into it, asset divestiture, whether you own a business, whether you're unemployed. I was the sole breadwinner for 26 years and, was lucky enough to have a very good job. And so, we led, a very full life, but then all of a sudden you've got to create two separate households, with that kind of same income. And so it gets very, very different. But I think you're right. In order to get to the point where you make those best decisions, because they're going to be lifelong decisions at that point, right? Once that legal document is drafted, it's a contract.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you've got to get yourself right. Like, I think, what do we call it here? Get today right. You got to get yourself right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You bring up a really good point when you said the word contract, because going back to the CDFA designation and viewing it from that lens, which is different from a financial planning lens, right? It's part of it, but it's also, again, working with the client and the attorney on the financial decisions that we make today and how those are going to impact that client in the future. And so working with a client kind of through that lens as a CDFA, we do have the ability to look at it from a objective point of view, in essence, just like you said, like your marriage was a legal contract.
Right.
So we have the ability to take the emotional piece out of it as we start to kind of look through kind of that whole financial contract piece.
Sure.
And one of them, like you mentioned, is it always starts off with, okay, now we're going to start dividing the assets.
Right.
And one of the things that we look at as a CDFA is when you're looking through, let's say, for example, a client will come to me and they'll present me with a preliminary settlement, packet. And what you'll eventually see will be all the assets. And at the end, it'll say, and I'm just going to use very simple numbers, she's going to get $1 million. He's going to get $1 million.
Yep.
Okay. So you look at this and you say, oh, well, this is even. Everything looks good. What's there to question? But when you dive deeper and you look at how are the assets split, it becomes really critical that you have someone that can look at that, right, objectively.
Right.
So, for example, if you have let's just say an IRA account that has $500,000, and you have an after-tax brokerage account that has $500,000, you put those on paper and each person is getting $500,000, right? So you would intuitively think, oh, well, this makes sense. When in fact, it doesn't, because the IRA is going to be all ordinary taxable income, subject to the required minimum distribution.
Right.
Whereas the brokerage account doesn't, right? It's subject to capital gains taxes, and there is no required minimum distribution. But what we oftentimes see, Scott, when we're working with a couple through divorce is that one party oftentimes is more financially savvy than the other person.
Right.
And so if you're that other person who's looking at this divorce settlement, you're saying, well, hey, we're each getting, in my earlier example, $1 million, so I'm just going to go ahead and sign. But like you said, once you sign, it's over.
Yep.
Whatever you agreed to, it's over.
Right.
And so, again, things that we want to think about as we're going through, that process, and where I feel someone that does have a CDFA background can help look at things with a different lens when it comes to property division, particularly assets, where we can look at things from a tax perspective, maybe from an estate planning perspective. We can look at things such as spousal support, child support, right? So there's lots of different nuances that go into this. And the first thing that I would, tell someone too is let's not rush, right? Let's take time. Let's methodically go through a lot of these things. But kind of step number one, when we think about where do we start?
Right.
Like where do we go with a divorce once we kind of decide, hey, we're thinking of divorcing, right? It's always going to be, okay, find an attorney, find someone that specializes in that family law, try to get with the CDFA. And then, step number two, start to go through your financial statements.
Yeah.
Right? So whether it's bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, anything that has a deed or a title to it.
Right.
These are all things that we want to pull together and start to go through, see who owns what, and kind of how are the assets today.
Yeah.
In your experience, did you find that process easy, pulling together all those statements and all those documents?
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. We owned, one of those things, right, is, we owned property in Scottsdale. And, what do? Do you sell it, right, and split the proceeds, or do you buy out that other party, right? There's different ways of looking at it. But it was pretty easy for us to do that, partially because, you legally have to disclose all that information, right? You've got to kind of pull everything together and provide it to the counterparty so that they know. It's almost like discovery, right, in legal proceedings where, you have to provide them with all the relevant information around your married life, right? What you owned, what you had a legal interest in, or, what your income was and what your spending was. You had to download bank statements for a number of months or even years so that it could be analyzed, right? Is this guy squirreling money away somewhere? Yeah. Probably the toughest part for us was that decision on property and the decision or the discussion around spousal maintenance. Yeah. Right? How much and how long. Yeah. And so that was the most difficult part to kind of go through because, the bottom line is I wanted to pay less and she wanted me to pay more. Yes. Right? So,
that's kind of how it usually goes.
Exactly.
One party wants more, one party wants to pay less.
Right. So you mentioned it's really important to line up your legal representation, as well as I think it's very important for somebody with any amount of investments and income to hire a CDFA, right? To get them on your team, let's call it. Like we're talking about the before component, right? Before, during, and after. So we're still on before. How early in that process would you suggest they engage you? Or engage Vector Wealth Management, I should say.
That's an excellent question. And I would say the sooner the better.
Okay.
Right? Many times clients get down the road and then they seek us. Okay. And now we're having to do a little backtracking. Yeah. It would be so much easier for all parties if we're thinking divorce is where this is headed. I would say the first thing to do is get your team together right away.
Yeah.
That really should be truly, like I said, find that legal person, but find that advisor that, you feel has that area of expertise that can get on that team right away to start helping you go through all the assets. And we can look at it from the lens of the tax piece.
Yep.
So you don't need to be a CPA or a tax preparer
Right.
to have a good understanding of
Yep.
how the tax law works as it pertains to different types of investment accounts, different types of assets.
Yep.
And so that, again, is something, particularly in that earlier example I gave,
Yeah.
where not all assets are created equal.
Right.
And again, that's a role that we want to play to say, hey, let us help you work through all the nuances of the different types of assets as we work to kind of do an equalization for the divorce process. But I think if a client or if an individual were to kind of follow some of those steps, I think it would make this process that, again, going back to the emotional piece, because not only are you having to deal with all of the logistics of it, but now you add that layer of the emotional piece on top. So I would say, try to do as much offloading with some of these other pieces onto other professionals as you can. Build that team. But if you can kind of work through some of these steps that we highlighted today, I think it will take the complexity of starting the divorce and make it a lot easier.
Right.
We have the ability, we can look at the returns. We can see if there's other interest, dividends, things like that have been paid on the return. Because a lot of times, most people don't even look at their tax return. They care about, do I owe money or do I get money back? But I don't actually page through it. So I don't know what's on a lot of those different schedules. But there's a lot of information that we can get from the return. And so again, trying to get that help right away so we can start to comb through these things together. I've had situations where individuals have a business. One spouse has a business. The other spouse knows that their spouse owns this business, but they're not engaged in the business.
Okay.
Well, that's a marital asset. And so, when in the scenario that I'm thinking of, they were using an extremely old business valuation.
Oh, sure.
And that never got caught until I get this paperwork, months down the road. And then I'm looking at this and I realize, oh my goodness, this business valuation is extremely outdated. And by going back, having a new business valuation, that client was able to get significantly more assets. So these are just things that the sooner you can get your team put together, the sooner that you can have the right people in place to help each party. Right? This isn't just one-sided. This is to try to make it fair or equitable, or to honor whatever wishes the two of you are wanting to have as an end result. But other things to kind of think about, and you kind of mentioned on this next one, it is about the marital home. That oftentimes becomes a big issue as well. So it's important to start to think about, what are we going to do with the marital home?
Especially if kids are involved, right? If they're still in the house.
Right. So do I get it? Do you get it? Do we keep it for a while? What is the debt on the home? And again, it's not uncommon for one party to say, I want the home. Okay, so I'm going to keep it. But oftentimes that home has a mortgage to it.
Right.
And now, again, one is coming out of the gate with an asset that has potentially significant debt against it, and can they make that monthly payment?
Right.
So it's important to really, it's easier for us to take that emotional piece out of it, to look at it financially, to say, I know you'd like the home, but can you afford the home?
Right. And that's part two, I think, of making a determination early on if there's going to be like a lump sum settlement, right? Or kind of like a continual payment. Because aren't there options when it comes to settlement, right? I'm not super familiar with that because we did sort of, spousal maintenance, and we divided the property equally. The whole 401k thing, the quadro, all that jazz, setting up an IRA here and there. And, it was a little more cut and dry for us, but yeah, I know there's a lot of different ways, and those decisions probably have to be made very early on, right?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say real early because, I mean, depending upon how this divorce goes, right? And Scott, you were so lucky because it sounds like you had a pretty amicable divorce. Like you said, you kind of used that the collaboration approach.
Yeah.
I wish more people could have that. Sadly, that's not what we see.
Yeah.
We oftentimes see, this party gets an attorney, this party gets an attorney. And the joke is they're fighting over the couch, and the person that's going to own the couch is going to be the attorney.
Right.
Because, right, the meter keeps running and running the more that we fight.
Right.
And so to your point, the thing about divorce is you can really craft it any way you want as long as both parties agree.
Right, exactly.
So if you can get that, like you call it, the collaboration of both parties, then it doesn't necessarily have to be equal.
Yep.
It just has to be fair.
Right.
And if both parties are in agreement, but what we oftentimes see is you think it's equal because one party may not know it's not.
Right.
And so when it comes to thinking about whether it's child support or spousal maintenance, step number one there is you have to go back and look at your state laws to see first of all, what state laws are in place that may give us guidance on how we're going to go down this path.
Okay.
Right? Child support, there's a formula. You can go on for the state of Minnesota. You can go down, you can, go into the computer, you enter, her income, his income, and earning potential. That's another one too, where one party may say, my earning potential may not be as great as yours.
Yep.
So these are things that are looked at. Same with spousal support. You're looking at how many years of marriage and what's the equality of, again, earning potential. What were you earning? What was she earning? So in your case, right?
Yeah.
You were the income provider and she was, the provider of your children.
Right.
So, and that's right. So how do you put a value on that?
Yeah. Right. No, for sure. Complicated.
It is.
Very.
It is. It can be very, and to, again, going back to your first point, that was complicated and you did it the easy way.
Right. That's what I was going to mention too. Exactly. Imagine if you got two sharks going after each other. It's, but what else should people be considering in that before stage?
So again, let's just kind of do a recap. So we want to make sure that you get your attorney or your representation. Look for a good CDFA. Gather your financial documents.
Yep.
We talked about support, right? Get what. And to your point, do you want a lump sum?
Yep.
Do you want monthly payments? And other factors with that support is if you're providing someone with support and something happens to you, then what?
Yeah.
So there's other layers. It's not just support. Sure. It's the what if the support ends. And
the answer there is I had to take out a life insurance policy for basically the duration of our agreement period that equaled the sum of the spousal maintenance.
Yes. And
that's really interesting.
And that's exactly the right approach.
And I had no idea. Yeah. Like I never would have thought about that, right? Yeah. But yeah.
And not only that, so taking out the life insurance policy, but then it's also providing documentation to that other person to make sure, hey, we didn't just take out this policy during the initial stage and then a year or two later let it lapse, right? That we're continuing to provide that ongoing verification that yes, that policy is still in effect. And do you have the ability to decrease that policy?
Right, exactly.
Right? So we don't have to keep it here.
Yep.
We could decrease it as that duration is coming to an end. So we think about, again, child support, spousal support. We talked about the housing, right? So start to think about what's going to happen to that home. And if it's something that it just isn't feasible, where would you go?
Right.
What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, even to that point, sorry to interrupt, but in that early stage too, is it's likely that, if you're thinking about it, somebody's going to move out, right?
Yeah.
So now they have to consider, you're renting an apartment for a few $1,000s a month, or you're, whatever, probably not going to live with friends or your parents at this stage, but unless you're very, very young doing that. Yeah,
It takes time.
it does.
I mean, we've seen divorces where parties, if they are in agreement, we've seen them as short as, a few months.
Mm-hmm.
But more often than not, this can go
Years.
several months
Mm-hmm.
to years, like
Yeah.
you just said.
Yep.
And, it's always our advice and recommendation, like, let's all try to be fair.
Yeah.
Because again, the meter keeps running on a lot of these different items. So one thing that, again, you did the collaboration approach, but another option is consider mediation.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Consider, instead of, jumping in and, trying to get this all resolved with his attorney, her attorney, consider, can we work with a mediator? Can we hire a mediator, one mediator
Yep.
that, represents both parties? Again, a CDFA can help work through all the nuances of all those financial pieces,
Okay.
right? Because
That's
again, whether it's, pension planning, retirement accounts, again, all the taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So they can help with the financial aspect, but that mediator can bring all those pieces together on top of the child support if there are minor children. It could be the spousal support,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of work through how will this look.
Okay.
In a perfect world, right? We love a perfect world. We would love to be able to work through a mediator,
Yep.
but we know that just doesn't always happen. But I think it should be at least a consideration to see, is this something that could be a viable approach? Or at least, at the very least, try it at first.
Mm-hmm.
And if mediation doesn't work, then we can go to our separate attorneys.
And I think that, the overarching theme here is, again, do what's best for yourself. You've got to kind of protect your best interests as well. And so I think that, doing a lot of this pre-work, this hiring a team, getting all of your documentation in order, it's just fair, right? I mean, it's fair for both parties to an extent. But yeah, so what else? Is there anything else, or should we think about wrapping?
I think just to kind of conclude, I would just say, from Vector's lens,
Mm-hmm.
we would love to be able to help you emotionally, and we'll certainly try to be that sounding board.
Yep.
But we can certainly help from the legal and the financial perspective, help guide clients through this process.
Yeah. Well, and, just my perspective working with, our firm, and it's a small firm. I have with 17, 18 people. So it's not, we're a big family, like to a big degree, right? Mm-hmm. And so by hiring someone at our firm, they're getting access to everybody that's here. So it's not just, I'm going to work with Sharon, I'm going to work with Mike, I'm going to work with Joe. Really, it's, you're getting the full experience. And we've all worked with folks that have gone through divorce. Every one of our senior wealth advisors has clients that have gone through that. So, so if somebody is watching this and we've struck a chord with them, likely what they should do is go to our website, vectorwealth.com, and on the website, there's a get started free consultation, whatever. Click that button. You'll schedule an appointment with likely me in that first stage just to have a conversation. And then, what we end up doing is deciding what direction we should head in with respect to the best resource at Vector for that individual. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Great.
And we certainly welcome the opportunity to work with anyone that is either starting this process or already in this process.
Yep.
So happy to be a resource as well.
Hey, thanks for listening to our podcast. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Be sure to consult first with a qualified financial advisor and/or a tax professional before implementing any investment strategy.